Good evening, everyone. So, we are very happy to have Sri Jairam Ramesh with us today. So, he's a widely respected economist, a politician, and a senior leader of the Indian National Congress. He's currently serving as a member of parliament representing Karnataka in the Rajya Sabha, as well as the chairperson of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Science and Technology, Environment and Forests. He graduated with a B.Tech in Mechanical Engineering from IIT Bombay in the year 1975, followed by a master's degree in Public Policy and Public Management from Carnegie-Mellon University. After working at the World Bank for a short period of time, he returned to India and actively participated in India's economic reforms. He has held many different portfolios and served in various ministries, including the Ministry of Environment and Forests, Drinking Water and Sanitation. As an economist, he was trusted with several crucial roles as an advisor to the Finance Minister and to the then Prime Minister. He has also served in the Planning Commission, the Ministry of Industry, and other economic wings of the government. His tenure as an Environment Minister, which was between 2009 and 2011, was very eventful and path-breaking. He held mammoth public hearings on BT Brinjal, with its eventual moratorium pending further studies and tests with appropriate protocols and laboratories. He further initiated a series of Indian studies on greenhouse gas emissions and black carbon, both as a means of countering the politicization of climate change by vested interests, and more importantly, to mitigate the vulnerability of India to climate change. Apart from his political career, he has also been an eminent columnist for many leading national dailies, such as Times of India, The Telegraph, Business Standard, and Business Today. He has also authored some very important books on economics and politics, including his book called Green Signals, which covers his experiences in the Environment Ministry. So today he'll be talking to us about his views on ecology, growth, and the democracy in India. Sir.
Dr. Subramaniam, Mrs. Radhakrishnan, we won't be. Sorry. Dr. Subramaniam, Mrs. Radhakrishnan, Ramchandra Guha, and friends. This is my second visit to the Raman Research Institute in the last 4 years. And it is really a pilgrimage to come here and see the finest tribute to India's finest scientist, who worked at a time when India was not independent, worked at a time when we were not interconnected, and who worked with supreme self-confidence that one day he will get the Nobel Prize. And that self-confidence was reflected in the fact that he changed his name from Venkatraman to Raman, because he said that the world will never understand the Venkatraman effect, but it will be moved by the Raman effect. Last year, I had occasion to write a biography of one of India's most remarkable administrators, Mr. P.N. Haksar, who played a very important role in science and technology policy, among other things, in the 70s. And in that book, I quote a note that Mr. Haksar sent to Indira Gandhi on the 31st of July, 1971. And I thought I'll begin my talk today by this note. So Haksar tells Indira Gandhi on the 31st of July, 1971, when the Bangladesh crisis is at its peak, defense planning is going on, diplomatic efforts are on, Indo-Soviet treaty is about to be signed. And amidst all this, Kissinger has come and gone, and amidst all this, Haksar finds the time to tell the Prime Minister, Dr. V. Radhakrishnan is the son of the late Professor C.V. Raman. I have referred to his paternity only by way of identification. Dr. Radhakrishnan is personally most allergic to being identified as a son of his most distinguished father. In point of fact, he left his country for Australia only to escape being submerged in the dominant personality of his father. I'm glad he did so. He has now blossomed forth as one of India's leading astrophysicists. Although he has agreed to become the director of the Raman Research Institute, he is still extremely sensitive and apprehensive. His main concern is to assure himself that he will receive blessing and support from the government for his ideas on how the Raman Research Institute should develop. I place below for the Prime Minister a paper he has prepared. I submit that the Prime Minister should give him encouragement and express the hope that he will develop his proposal and that the PM on her part will give full support. The amounts involved are pitifully small, but if Dr. Radhakrishnan comes and takes up his residence, we will have in the Raman Research Institute one of the finest institutions of scientific eminence from world standards. And so it has turned out to be. 31st of July 1971, 5 days later, Dr. Radhakrishnan meets Indira Gandhi in the presence of Mr. Haksar and Professor M.G.K. Menon, gets an assurance from the Prime Minister that the Raman Research Institute would get full support from the Government of India, and the rest of the story all of you know. So I thought this is a good way of beginning and reminding ourselves of the difficult transition that took place after the demise of C.V. Raman. There is, of course, another section in the book, to those of you who are interested, on how Mr. Haksar got another distinguished Indian who happened to be your chairman for a long time, back from Caltech, where he was on a sabbatical, on the untimely death of Vikram Sarabhai to take over India's space program. And Satish Dhawan gets persuaded. He was not very keen to come back. He was keen to come back as a director of the Indian Institute of Science, but he was not keen to take over from Sarabhai as chairman of ISRO. But he's persuaded, and he puts only two conditions, which are unheard of today. First condition, he should be allowed to remain as director of the Indian Institute of Science. And the second condition, that the headquarters of ISRO should be Bangalore. Both these conditions were fulfilled, and the rest again is history as far as space is concerned. So today I want to talk about ecology, economy, and growth. Ecology, economy, and democracy. Now, many years ago, Robert Mundell, who is the Nobel laureate in economics in 1999, came up with what in international economics is called the impossibility theorem. He called this the trilemma. It's called Mendelian Trilemma in economics. The trilemma states that a country cannot fulfill each of these three objectives simultaneously. It cannot have free capital flows, it cannot have exchange rate stability, and it cannot have an independent monetary policy. A country can hope to have two of these three objectives, but it cannot fulfill all the three objectives at the same time. You cannot have free capital flows, you cannot have an independent monetary policy, and you cannot have a stable exchange rate. Subsequently, 15 years later, Danny Roderick was another international economist, came up with the Roderick trilemma, which has now gained currency in political science. And the Roderickian trilemma in political science is that you cannot have globalization, you cannot have, that is, deep economic integration, you cannot have sovereignty, and you cannot have democracy all at the same time. This is the political equivalent of the economics trilemma, that a country cannot hope to globalize, maintain its democratic foundations, retain its sovereignty, all three at the same time. At best, it can fulfill two of these three objectives. Now, today I'm going to pose a third trilemma to you and ask the question, can we triangulate the objectives of economic growth, ecological protection, and democratic systems at the same time? Are the three incompatible with each other, or can India find a way of somehow having a little of each of the three, if not all of the three, so that we do not abandon commitment to each or one of these three important objectives? For this, I think I need to go back and ask the question, why is it that we need to worry about this trilemma in the first place? We are a democracy, and we take our democracy for given. I think this has been the greatest achievements over the last 70 years. In spite of many vicissitudes, many ups and downs, the maintenance and the deepening of our democratic traditions has been a cause of great pride and satisfaction to almost all of us. We are also well aware that because of demographic pressures, we need to grow faster, we need to create jobs, we need more investment, we need greater economic integration with the rest of the world. At the same time, we are all concerned about natural resources. We're concerned about the air we breathe, the water we drink, the forests that we take for granted very often, the rivers, the mountains. So each of us, in some way or the other, is wedded to each of these three objectives. We want economic growth, we want ecological protection, and we want our democracy to survive and strengthen. The real question is, can all three of them be achieved at the same time? For that, I would like to ask the first question, why should we in fact triangulate? Why can't we be satisfied with two out of the three objectives? Why should we pursue, Mao's famous saying was, a country must learn to walk on two legs. Why should India now learn to walk on three legs? Why can't we be satisfied with walking on two legs? And I want to suggest to you 4 reasons why India must now show to the rest of the world that this is not a trilemma, that all these three objectives, economy, ecology, and democracy, are perfectly compatible with each other and can in fact be achieved. What are these 4 reasons? First, the demographic reason. We are today 1.3 billion, and we are going to be adding 400 million people over the next 25 to 30 years. We'll be 1.7 billion by the turn of the middle of the century. It'll be a young population. A median age today is 28. The median age by 2050 would be somewhere in the early 30s. And the sheer demographic pressures that this puts on our system, on our economic system, for jobs, for consumption, for investment, is something that we cannot wish away. This is something that is an integral part of our future, the demographic future. Many countries are seeing stable populations. Some countries are in fact seeing declining populations. China's population is going to start declining by the middle of the next decade. But India is going to continue to see this increasing population up to the year 2060 or 2070, although there are some regional variations. South India will actually start coming down, and north and the east will be at an increasing pace, but I don't want to get into that. As a country as a whole, our population would continue to increase. So the demographic pressure is very real. And other countries don't have to worry about future generations. We have, because we are going to be adding 1/3 of our current generation in the next 30 years. Second, no longer is climate change an academic issue. Climate change is today a living reality to all of us in this country. Whether we talk about the impact of the climate change on the variability of the Indian monsoon, whether we talk about the impact of the climate change on the retreat of the Himalayan glaciers, whether we look at climate change in terms of the increase in sea levels along a 7,500 kilometer long coastline, or whether we see climate change in terms of the impact it has on our forests, because our forests are the largest repositories today of coal, iron ore, bauxite, uranium, which we have to mine in order to sustain our economic growth. So no longer, 10 years ago, for us, climate change was something that was being caused by the West. But today, when we are seeing all around us the impacts of climate change on livelihoods and other aspects of our economy, we cannot any longer ignore climate change. And India, because of its demographic pressures, has this climate change challenge also a living reality. Thirdly, after the demographic pressure and the climate change, we are now beginning to see morbidity and mortality impacts of environmental pollution. So far, pollution has been seen to be the price we pay for economic growth and for prosperity. But we don't realize already the morbidity and mortality impacts in place after place, from air pollution, from water pollution, from chemical contamination, and from other forms of degradation of natural resources. Between the year 2000 and 2015, 8% of all deaths in India were attributable to pollution. Largely air pollution, but a large part of it is also water pollution. Water pollution, incidentally, the morbidity and mortality impacts of water pollution are slightly more longer term in nature than they are in terms of air pollution, which is much more instantaneous, and that's why you see how the pollution scare in Delhi has, not the scare, but the real pollution situation in Delhi has become a cause of worldwide concern. So the public health consequences of environmental issues have become far more real and far more direct today than they were ever before. And no longer can we dismiss environment as a middle-class, elitist issue. It is an issue of public health. It is an issue that affects the poor, it affects the marginalized, it affects the weaker sections of society. And therefore, this is something that India has to come to grips with sooner rather than later. And finally, unlike in many countries of the world which have reached per capita incomes of $10,000 and above, including China, environmental issues in India are largely issues related to livelihoods. They are issues related to access to land, access to water, access to forest resources. So, in a way, what we are looking at, as the famous environmentalist Anil Agarwal called, what we are looking at in India is not lifestyle environmentalism, but more livelihood environmentalism, where environmentalism plays a very important role in the day-to-day livelihood activities of large sections of our people. So the answer to the question why India must learn to triangulate these three apparently contradictory objectives is four in nature: the demographic challenge, the climate change challenge, the public health challenge, and the fact that environment is now impacting on livelihoods. So this traditional model of economic growth, unfortunately, does not give us any recipe for how do we meet these three objectives. Because the traditional economic model is a grow now, pay later model. You have 8%, 9% economic growth for the next 20 or 25 years, and you deal with the consequences of that growth much later. The US has done this, Europe has done this, China is going through this model, and India, if we do not make mid-course corrections, and one of the advantages of being a latecomer to the high growth league is that we are in a position to make changes midway. If we do not make these changes midway, we will also follow the American and the Chinese models, which is we will end up polluting our way to prosperity, we will end up deforesting our way to prosperity, which is simply not sustainable in the long run. Now, I want to take a couple of examples from my own experience to give you some idea of how these three apparently mutually contradictory objectives of economic growth, ecological protection, and democratic traditions can in fact coalesce, can in fact be achieved as part of public policy. You mentioned B.T. Brinjal in the introduction. This is a big debate that is going on in India. Should India invest heavily in genetically modified foods? Scientific opinion is divided. Civil society opinion is divided. Political opinion is divided. But the fact is that because of our population, because of our land constraints, because of our productivity challenges, people are always looking for new avenues for the application of technology to improve productivity. 50 years ago, it was the Green Revolution. And today, people are talking of a revolution based on genetics and genetic engineering and on transgenic plants. India went in for BT cotton in 2002. And when I became Environment Minister in 2009, I had the first challenge I had to face is, should India give the green signal for the introduction, the commercialization of genetically modified brinjal? We all like Bangan ka bharta. Do we want BT Bangan ka bharta? That was the issue that was being asked. And the scientific view was that we should go ahead. We've had 9 years of scientific assessment and we should go ahead. And then I said, look, let's ask ourselves the question, is brinjal essential for food security? Why are we doing genetically modified brinjal? Is there a scientific consensus on genetically modified brinjal? What does civil society have to say about this? And what is the international practice as far as genetically modified foods are concerned? Now, the US follows a permissive approach to genetic engineering. The Europeans adopt a prohibitory approach. And after a long round of public consultations across the country, I came up with this idea that we should neither be permissive nor be prohibitive, but like the typical Indian, find a middle path and become precautionary. So we adopted the precautionary principle that this is risky, we are embarking on a new enterprise, let us wait till we realize what we are getting into, particularly because India is the center for genetic diversity as far as brinjals are concerned, and therefore a moratorium was imposed on BT brinjal. Now, I got criticized by my own colleagues, including, I might say, my own Prime Minister, saying that, if I had adopted this approach, Dr. Swaminathan would never have introduced the Green Revolution in the 1960s, because every technological leap brings with it risks and unknown factors. However, the fact is that after a long process in which economic factors were considered, environment factors were considered, my view was that this was too important a view to be left to technocratic decision makers alone, but this is something in which democracy must play a larger role in deciding what India must do. We had public hearings in 8 different states of the country. Over 50,000 people participated in these public hearings. Something like 200 or 250 representations came from different organizations, and ultimately a decision got taken that a moratorium would be placed. In my view, that is one example in which this apparent conflict of these 3 objectives was sought to be met, but a greater premium was put on one of the 3 objectives, which was the strengthening of our democratic traditions. Let me take a second example, which is on what do we do on hydel projects. Now, we can't invest in coal because coal produces CO2. We can't invest too much in nuclear. I'll come to this a little later. But nuclear plants take 10 years, 15 years to come on stream, and they have their own risks. Renewables is a very attractive option, but they generate power only 20% of the time. We don't have much oil or gas. We will have to import the oil and gas, but we have a lot of hydel resources. And therefore, hydel energy, clean energy, from an environmental point of view, from a CO2 point of view, not necessarily from an environmental point of view, but from a CO2 emissions point of view, very clean. So why can't we invest more in hydel power? Now, when you really look at what was happening in the case of hydel power, large projects were on stream which involved submergence of vast areas of forest land, displacement of large amounts of local communities, location of hydel projects in seismically active areas. And this became another bone of contention during my tenure as Environment Minister. Many of these projects were in one state alone. 50% of all of India's remaining hydel potential is in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. And we had almost 300 projects being planned in Arunachal Pradesh and for power to be evacuated from Arunachal Pradesh. A lot of projects were planned on the river Ganga, particularly in Uttarakhand. Now, the issue was this. We need hydel power from an economic point of view. We've had public hearings for the location of these hydel projects, so we have fulfilled these democratic the democratic requirements of our law. But the question was, are they environmentally benign, or are they going to have large-scale adverse impacts on the environment? And to cut a long story short, projects that were actually being implemented on the upper reaches of the Ganga, for example, the Alaknanda, the Bhagirathi, the Mandakini, I had put a stop to them because of their large-scale impacts on not just in terms of submergence of land and relocation of people, but also in terms of making the Ganga, we talk of clean Ganga, we talk of Nirmal Ganga, Swachh Ganga, but you cannot have Nirmal Ganga without Aviral Ganga. If you don't have water in the river, there's nothing that you can do about it. You've got to have a minimum ecological flow in your water bodies. And with the construction of these large number of hydel projects, the uninterrupted continuous flow of water was being impeded. So we put a stop to many of these hydel projects. Again, this was a contentious issue, but I believe this was an issue in which environmental considerations predominated over the considerations of economic growth, and we said we have to have a compromise, and the compromise is we will allow hydel projects in areas which do not have large submergence, which are not seismic in nature, and which ultimately do not impact on uninterrupted flow in the rivers on which they are planned. The third example that I want to take is on bauxite mining in Niyamgiri. You must have read about this. This is a famous project that was being planned by the Vedanta group for the mining of bauxite in the Niyamgiri hills in Kalahandi district of Orissa. Now, everybody wants aluminum. Aluminum is energy efficient, it's lightweight, everything is going aluminum. So what's wrong when India has got the 4th largest bauxite reserves in the world? So why should we not be making our own aluminum? And on that consideration, permission was given to this company to mine the bauxite out of the Niyamgiri hill. Now, unfortunately, for them, this Niyamgiri hill is a sacred hill. It's the Ram Janmabhoomi, Ayodhya, to take a current example, is the Ayodhya as far as the Dongariya cones are concerned. Only 4,000 people, for only 4,000 people these hills were sacred, whereas I was told billions of people will benefit if bauxite is going to be mined out of the Niyamgiri hills. The question here, it was environmentally possible through the use of proper technology to mine bauxite. It was economically desirable to mine bauxite, However, the question was, does this project fit into the spirit of our democracy? And the spirit of our democracy is not always to listen to the voice of the majority, but also have small groups, small minorities, arithmetical minorities, have their voice in decision making. If cultural traditions of communities are going to be affected by these projects, it is the responsibility of the state to protect these cultural traditions. A similar example was in Sikkim, where many hydel projects were being planned which would submerge traditional sites, burial sites for Buddhist communities, which are small in number in Sikkim. However, they're very much Indian citizens and part of the Indian political framework. So here the challenge was not so much environment, not so much economics, but more sending a signal to different groups in the country that Indian democracy can be sensitive, even though you may not be numerically very large, but because Indian democracy has the capacity to be responsive to situations, even of small groups, however endangered they may be. So I just want to summarize by saying that in the process of policy making, conflicts are inevitable. Trade-offs are inevitable. But I think we must find a way, we have to find a way of moving on all three tracks simultaneously. Now, in the process of moving on these three tracks simultaneously, sometimes economic objectives will get primacy, sometimes environmental objectives will get primacy, and sometimes the political objective of strengthening Indian democracy will get primacy. This is inevitable. But the nature of decision making is such that you cannot please everybody at the same time. Someone or the other is going to be displeased. But it is, in the essence of decision making, the essence of triangulation is to achieve balanced dissatisfaction. You can never achieve balanced satisfaction. You can't satisfy all sections. But if you have dissatisfied everybody equally, I think you have done your job very well. I think the litmus test of triangulation is balanced dissatisfaction. When the land acquisition law was passed in 2013, all the industry associations criticized me for saying that this law will hold back Indian industrialization. At the same time, Medha Patkar issued a long statement of how this land acquisition law is not progressive, pro-capitalist, pro-industry, pro-corporate sector. And so when I was asked in Parliament, what do I have to say? I said the fact that CII, FICCI and Medha Patkar are all agreed that this law is not good shows that this law is in the right direction. So everybody has been left unhappy because we have tried to make an effort to please everybody. But you can't please everybody 100%. You can't have each of these three objectives 100%. And I think that is the reality that we have to contend with. We cannot be growth purists. We cannot say growth at all costs. We cannot be environmental fundamentalists. We cannot say environmental protection at all costs. But I think certainly we can be democracy purists and say that whatever we do in terms of economy, whatever we do in terms of ecology, we should do it as part of a democratic process. And I have to say to you that India is one of the few countries in the world which has the most progressive laws. We have the most progressive institutions. We, last 35, 40 years, long before it became fashionable, ecology and ecological balance became part of our regulatory system. Now, as Gopal Gandhi once said, that Indians take great delight in passing laws, but greater delight in bypassing them. The fact is that many of these laws are on paper. They have not been enforced. But the fact is that India has a plethora of laws, plethora of regulations, plethora of institutions. And I think this was an early recognition that environment is going to play a very important role in our economic growth. So I want to end by saying that this apparent trilemma, we have to find a way to fix it. We have to find a way of meeting the goals of faster economic growth, deeper environmental protection, and stronger democratic conventions and traditions all at the same time. None of the three can be postponed. And I think it is possible as we learn, as we move along, and there is no textbook formula. There is no recipe for this. It is something that we have to take case by case. Compromises will have to be struck. Some middle ground has to be found. But I think that we would be doing ourselves a great disservice if we fall prey to this thinking that we must have growth at all costs, or the other extreme where we say that everything that leads to higher growth has some environmental impact, and therefore it's better not to have that impact by postponing that growth. That also is simply not possible because of the demographic and other challenges. So the one message that I wish to convey, and I'll close here, is that India does need faster economic growth. It needs deeper ecological consciousness. It certainly needs deeper ecological systems of protection and preservation, and it needs strengthen its democratic institutions at various levels. And through the political process, it is possible for us to find the way forward. And I think it's the collective task of economists, of scientists, of engineers, intellectuals, media persons, to actually try to find this middle path rather than to position environment, development, and democracy as things being in conflict or incompatible with each other. Thank you. Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, I think we can have a couple of questions.
So, in the way I've seen things evolve, there's often what happens, and of course, I mean, I'm all for the strengthening of democratic processes, but often the discussion is very ill-informed. Let me give you what comes out in the public domain, which is going to contribute to people, voting for a particular choice, is not necessarily the actual objective reality of a particular of the situation, but it is masked in various ideological or certain stated positions which remain fixed, irrespective of what kind of evidence can be brought to bear. And I'll make it a little bit specific. For instance, a nuclear deal of the first, which was in the first UPA government. I mean, there was very little discussion in the entire media about how, if we transform to nuclear power in a way, I mean, what would be the advantages of that thing? I mean, there were a whole bunch of positions which were stated very aggressively, but it doesn't lend itself to, to putting out the information in the right way so that people can be democratic in their choice but still make an informed decision. And so how do we get the system in place where the democracy actually strengthens the way forward?
Well, traditionally, in these areas, decisions have been handed down top-down. These are basically technocratic decisions. And you've taken the example of nuclear power. And this is a quintessential example where decisions were taken. And it's not a surprise, it's not a coincidence that the strongest public agitation in the last, say, decade on environmental issues was in Kudankulam, was against the nuclear power plant, with the fishermen who were protesting against the two nuclear power plants. The nuclear power plants were signed in Moscow. Nuclear power plants was taken as good because they are clean. They don't want to emit CO2, but they have other risks. So we went ahead. But then we saw after 2006 what the huge public protest which accompanied the commissioning of both the plants. Now, the law is very clear. The law says, the Environmental Protection Act of 1986, by the way, the Environmental Protection Act of 86 is a hugely powerful law because it was enacted in the wake of the world's worst industrial tragedy in Bhopal in December 1984. So in 1986, India, there was a certain commitment to strengthen our regulatory systems for environment. Now, the Environment Protection Act says that every project before it gets implemented must go through a system of public hearings. Now, when I became Environment Minister, and I said, let's go through all the projects and let's find out for ourselves how effective these public hearings have been. I had to say this. I mean, I said it then, and I don't mind saying it again, that the system of public hearings had become where there was public, there was no hearing, and where there was hearing, there was no public. And the worst culprit in this was the government. The worst culprit were the coal mines, were the nuclear power plants, were the hydro projects, were the coal-based projects. There was no difference between the private and the public. We assume that public means we are a little more sensitive, we are a little more law-abiding. I didn't find any evidence of that. So the law is there. The law is very clear. By the way, Kerala gives you a very good example. Coke had to stop extraction of groundwater in Kerala because the local governments in Kerala protested, agitated. Now, Kerala is an outlier on many things. It's an outlier in terms of public consciousness and in terms of public pressure that is brought to bear. Local governments are very powerful, but this is not always true everywhere. But I think one way of addressing the concern that you have raised is to empower local administrations, local governments, far more than we have done in the past. Unfortunately, the trend is in the opposite direction. For example, the Land Acquisition Law of 2013 said that you cannot use forest land in tribal areas, if you're without the permission of the Gram Sabha. Or if you're putting up a project in a tribal area, you need to get permissions of the Gram Sabha. Now, the word was actually in consultation with the Gram Sabha. Now, we are experts at hair splitting. So, the question was, does consultation means concurrence or does it mean batchit? Naturally, government will take the view it means only, chat. But actually it meant prior informed consent. But that law, state after state has amended. Karnataka has amended, Telangana has amended, Tamil Nadu has amended. So the trend is somewhere else. But in the long run, the only way you're going to get people agitated about the impact of these economic interventions on their livelihoods and on their natural resources is to empower them through the process. And it's happening in small places. It happened many years ago with the Chipko movement. Ram Guha has written a whole book on that. It happened in the case of the Chipko movement in the late 70s in Uttarakhand. It happened in the case of Bosco. It happened in the case of Sterlite. You must have read about the Sterlite case in Thoothukudi, where 13 people were killed in police firing. And these people were saying, close down the copper smelter, which is polluting the city. So people have got up, they have agitated. Somewhere they have been successful. Somewhere hydro projects have been stopped from being implemented. Somewhere coal mines have not been opened because of people not wanting to give up their lands. So the common underlying thread is strong local institutions and empowerment of local institutions and the second important thing is the enforcement of the laws that we have. You enforce the laws that we have on environment, then many of the things that we are seeing, you will not see. Yes, can you have the mic, please?
Sir, do you want to sit? Are you
No, it's okay. I'm okay.
And the other example is in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, the Jarawa, through the Jarawa land, this road was built. And that shows immense insensitivity on the part of the government.
Sorry?
The Jarawa, the Jarawa land,
Yes. Well,
through the Jarawa land, the road was built. And what kind of a government does it? So
Well, you raised another. I mean, I didn't have time to go into all this, but I spent 2 days, in the Jarawa areas, and the highway that was being built, and people wanted the highway. The local administration wants the highway. The central government wants the highway. They want to develop the tourism, the tourism at the end of the road, and the question was, why can't we integrate the Jarawas into the mainstream of society? We tried to do this with the Onges, and we came a cropper. And I think the policy of allowing the Jarawas their own time, their own space, their own traditions was a sound tradition. But it is extraordinarily painstaking. It goes against the way governments actually function. So about 200, 220 of them still, highly endangered. The road is operational now. The highway is yet to be built, but the road is operational. And yes, I mean, there are Jarawas, there are other tribes in parts of Orissa, parts of Jharkhand, which are extremely vulnerable. And these are, by the way, these are people who get displaced. Leave the Jarawas aside. If you look at Orissa, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, you will find tribal communities who have been displaced not once, but they have been displaced twice or thrice. Walter Fernandez, one of India's very well-known social scientists, had done a study some years ago which said that between 1950 and 1985, 35-year period, more than 20 million people have been displaced because of coal mining, hydel projects, irrigation projects, industrial projects, and so on. And many of these are not one-time movers. They've actually been displaced not once or twice, but sometimes even thrice. And it's not a great surprise that if you look at the map of India and you look at our forest resource, you look at where the forest areas are, look at where the minerals are, you look at where the tribal populations are, and where you look at where the Maoist violence is, they almost converge one to one. So there is a political cost that we are paying to the type of policies that we are adopting.
So I just had a question about, here I am. Yeah. The two sides of this triangle, which are democracy and economic growth. It depends also very much on the economic model we're talking about. And the models of the United States and particularly neoliberal capitalist models that are there, there is a very deep tension between that and democracy. One of the things that we haven't done in our democracy is invested widely in public education, in government schools, in public health. These are things, for whatever wrong reasons or right reasons China has, the United States has, Europe has. In terms of long-term economic interests, these are also very, very important. So the way in which we see growth as the only economic indicator, and when we pit that against democracy, when we pit that against inequalities that have risen world over, but I think very much so in India, it seems that that debate has to be far more nuanced than simply this and that, but the nature of what that economic model is, and the fact that we are so shy about using the word socialism, which is, I think, a really big shame.
Well, it's absolutely true, but unfortunately, economics knows only one model. Post-war economic development, Gandhi was the only man who offered an alternative vision. Let's be very clear on this. Only person who has given an alternative economic model was Gandhi. Now, for historical reasons, for political reasons, I happen, to think for the right reasons, we followed a somewhat different model. And we followed the model which was a hybrid of the Soviet model and the Western model. But that model is essentially predicated on resource extraction, resource use, greater consumption, and if you're selling 2 million cars in a year and you sell 1.96 million cars the next year, the headline is economic slowdown in India. You don't stop to think that selling 1.6 million cars may actually be better for India than selling 2 million cars. So I think one of the things that Ram is here, he's written many books, and I'm sure many of you have read his books, but one book which has not got the attention that it deserves, which I think everybody should read. He's known for Gandhi, he's known for all his other books, Congress bashing and so on, but he wrote a book called How Much Do We Consume? How much should a person consume? And he looked at it from a consumption point of view. Basically, that was the Gandhian argument as well, you see. So I think that the economic model is based on investment. More jobs, more economic growth, GDP and so on. But ultimately, it's consumption. What do we consume? That is important. Now, it's very difficult, to be honest with you, it's very difficult for any political leader to get up and say, we have to consume less. Very difficult. Every political leader, irrespective of political party, will get up and say, we need more factories, we need more highways, we need more broad gauge lines, we need more power plants, we need more mobile phones, we need more refrigerators. I can't see anybody actually getting up and questioning this economic model. So in a way, it's a bit of a defeatist attitude, but I think I'm being realistic. We cannot change the broad parameters of the economic model, which is given, but within that economic model, if we can find ways of doing things less destructively of the environment, less destructively of energy, less destructively of raw material, we may be better off. We are at an advantage. We are at an advantage because unlike China, which has grown at 8% for 30 years, we have grown at 8% only for 8 years. So, we are a latecomer in this high growth league. So, we can make some of these changes that we need to make this triangle a reality. But the trends are not positive because you see the whole conventional wisdom is different. The wisdom is that consumption is an engine of growth. Investment is an engine of growth. Exports are an engine of growth. And what is growth? GDP. We have not yet defined a measure, a metric of economic growth that accounts for costs and benefits to the environment. Our GDP, as we measure GDP, takes into account only obsolescence and use of physical capital. It does not reflect the use of natural resources, either positively or negatively. Sometimes we can be also positive. So till that happens, till the world moves to an alternative metric, I'm afraid we are stuck with this GDP metric. So, and this GDP metric is a very dangerous metric because it is used to build highways through Corbett, or it is used to create hydel projects in seismic zones, or it is used to build nuclear power plants where the fishermen are opposed to the nuclear power plants. So there is a worship of growth.
And it's also used to increase inequality. I was asking about the link to democracy because democratic structures are more and more compromised the more inequality there is in society, because even though people have the vote, they really don't have a say. So the more money gets concentrated in the hands of a few, the less democracy is functional. And that's the tension I'm asking you about, because it seems to me that unless we address that part of the economic model, we can't really implement democracy in a meaningful way. And you can see that even in the United States, that the meaning of democracy has modified over the years, in the last 30 years.
Well, you know, my experience has been that the desire for the benefits of this economic model that we are talking about and which we criticize is far more widespread in society than we give it credit for. I mean, people want a better standard of living. People want not necessarily a better quality of life, but they want a higher standard of living. I agree with you, they want better schools, they want better hospitals, no doubt, and that's the responsibility of the state. But, you know, they want better roads, they want better access to markets, they want better consumer goods. So I think we have to balance many of these factors, and it's difficult. The political economy, in the political economy, it requires a Gandhi to speak of consumption, speak of austerity, to speak of things that, you know, recycling, to conservation. These are, after Gandhi, there's not very many people who have done this. Today, if you were to do this, you will be thought of as somebody who is challenging the very nature of the growth process. You're challenging the very aspirations of people for a better quality of, for a higher standard of living, not necessarily a better quality of life. But, you know, I'm not a romantic as far as local institutions, local bodies are concerned, but the evidence does suggest, that where local governments have been empowered, where local governments have been allowed to function, outcomes have been different. Now, Kerala is one example. Incidentally, Karnataka is a good example. But this was, I'm sorry to say, but, you know, this was a good example when Mr. Ramakrishna Hegde was the chief minister. But then subsequent governments came and systematically emasculated whatever achievements had been done during that period of time. West Bengal, once upon a time, was a good example before local governments became Kadar Raj, you know, and the CPM Kadar Raj now has become the TMC Kadar Raj. So, local governments have got emasculated in the process. There are, for a while we thought women's self-help groups will provide, if panchayats and nagarpalikas are institutions of representation, women's self-help groups are institutions of participation. So we had in Uttarakhand, in Himachal Pradesh, in Andhra Pradesh, in Tamil Nadu, you know, good examples of women's self-help groups taking power. But again, to what extent have they been successful? I think the evidence is still very, very mixed.
Go ahead, after you, go ahead.
Sir, you mentioned during your talk about the current political system, where I see most of the policy-making decision in a democratic setup is influenced or supposed to reflect the voice of the people. If you have to take some important policy matters which are probably good for the country, I'll take the example of GM cotton, for example. Let's assume for a moment that it is good for the country, for argument's sake. It's quite possible that 90% of the farmers, leave alone commenting about the pros and cons of the policy, they may not even know what is genetically modified cotton. Either their awareness level is so low or the literacy level in the country is pathetic. This being the case, if all our policy making decisions have to go by the arithmetic majority with the people who are not adequately aware of it, don't you think our policy making process gets completely skewed and we take a backseat? In this type of a conflict situation, what is your solution for this?
Well, 99.9% of farmers in India are using GM cotton now, BT cotton. So this is the argument that Mr. Sharad Pawar would always give me, saying don't assume farmers are illiterate, Don't assume that farmers don't want better economic returns, because over 99.5% of farmers in India are using BT cotton. So that reality is also there, that farmers respond to economic incentives. BT cotton gave them, higher returns, higher productivity, and they've all gone for BT cotton. But it's also a fact that BT cotton has resulted in increasing suicides, particularly in rain-fed areas of India, where there's no irrigation, of which Vidarbha is the best example. I would be hard put to find decisions that governments take that are a result of a bottom-up consultative process. To be honest with you, I would be very hard put to find examples. More examples abound of decisions, major economic decisions, which have been taken by governments in the expectation that they will benefit a large number of people, and people were willing to pay the cost at that point of time. All of you welcomed demonetization 3 years ago. Why? Because you thought that India is going to be a cleaner country. India is going to be a corruption-free country. India is going to be a booming cashless, less cash economy. 3 years later, we have not. But 3 years ago, Indians had this view that demonetization is not a bottom-up decision. It was a top-down decision. 50 years ago, Bhakra Nangal was implemented on the assumption that Bhakra Nangal is going to transform India's agriculture. Now we are seeing the ecological costs of Bhakra Nangal. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, you could say Bhakra Nangal shouldn't have been implemented. I mean, that's one view. There are many people who will take that view. But there are extenuating circumstances. There would be people who would say, no, Bhakra Nangal was a decision that is right. It saved India. It gave India the Green Revolution in the 60s. Okay, it has had adverse consequences. Let us deal with the problems of salinity and waterlogging as and when they arise. So bottom-up decision making, it's very difficult for me to give you examples. But I can give you examples from my experience. In 2 years, I did 3 public consultations. One on BT cotton, on BT brinjal. The second is on coastal zone regulations. That we wanted to come up with new rules for regulating construction in coastal areas. So we had public consultations in 8 different coastal areas of India. And a third public consultation we had on forest policy. Again, in different parts of India. Those public consultations were large. People attended, they gave their ideas. The idea was to open up the decision-making process. The decision-making process got opened up, and I lasted only for 2 years as Environment Minister. So that was the direct impact of democratizing decision-making. I don't think governments are comfortable with democratizing decision-making. It's it'd be a very unique leader who will say, let's listen to people whether they want this nuclear power plant or not. Most leaders will say, India needs nuclear power. Atomic Energy Establishment will find the best site for the nuclear power station. And then, if there are people who are disaffected, people who are to be relocated, we will pay them adequate compensation. And that's the mindset. Yeah, Ram.
So, Jairam, since we are in a science institute, I want to ask you a question related to science and scientific expertise. So, you've talked about the triangulation. I completely agree with you about the strengthening of local institutions, and I'm glad you mentioned the Janata government in the 1980s and the work it did. And in fact, Madhav Galtigil's early work on sustainable forest water management showed that was a very good period till your party came into power and reversed it. So, all right. Leave that aside. Leave that aside. Now, but the middle part of the triangulation is economic growth. There's a cult of growth and consumption and production and energy and resource intensive growth, which was shared by the socialist countries and the capitalist countries. And it's clearly, as you pointed out in the early remarks now with climate change, unsustainable in the long run. We have to adapt. So one way is greater decentralization. Now, when you come to ecology, I think one of the aspects, very disturbing aspects of policy making in the last 10 or 12 years, maybe 15, 20 years, is the contempt for experts. I mean, we do have many outstanding scientists in this country who are not, nature-loving, romantic environmentalists, tree-hugging romantic environmentalists, who are people who will use their science to tell you how to manage resources in an efficient, sustainable, energy-conserving way. Okay. And some of them, as people here know, are from the city. Now, two of them, one tragically no longer with us, so AK and Reddy. Now, AK and Reddy, did any government ever take AK and Reddy's ideas on energy policy seriously? Why has no one looked at his demand side approach? Why do we still go for a supply side approach? More nuclear plants, more hydro plants, etc. The other is Madhav Gadgil, who is still with us, and whom you consulted. Now, these are just two stars. Madhav Gadgil and AK and Reddy are two colossal figures globally who have shown how science can be used to fulfill all three parts of that triangle: economic growth, environmental sustainability, democracy. Now, but there are many younger scientists also. Now, they are never consulted. Now, the interesting thing about governance in India, and you are an exception in those 2 years, because Madhav Gadgil wrote a report under your guidance, you had other people, is that we are a knowledge-proof polity. And this cuts across all political parties. So, if Bangalore needs greater access to the airport, there was a steel flyover that was being built. Now, the BJP will do the same thing as the Congress party. They will not consult one of the world's leading transport experts who sits in IISc, who's a young man called something Verma, he's a Professor Verma, who can tell you how to get 5 million people every year to the airport without screwing up the environment and doing it efficiently. Right? He can tell you that. Likewise, with water, with housing, with energy, with forests, we have now, after 40, 50 years of developing scientific expertise, quite a lot. Mr. Fadnavis wants to build a metro in Bombay. He's not going to consult IIT Bombay, who can give him good advice, by the way, right? Now, you consulted Madhav Gadgil, and after you left, your successor would not even give India's greatest ecological scientist an audience, right? Now, this is a political economy of decision making, which is knowledge proof, because scientists are anathema to politicians, to bureaucrats, and to contractors all. Right, that is the nexus. It's also the IAS guys. Now, one of the interesting things about the Environment Ministry is that it's been, at least the Environment Ministry was started in 1980 as a department. I think the last scientist to be a secretary of the Environment Ministry was probably Dr. Qasim in 1985. So for 35 years, you had a Babu who will do what his master tells him to do. Right? No, where you actually could have good people. I mean, so I think this is something that's very interesting. It's very disturbing. It's not really to be laughed at. That we have in our country, unlike, shall we say, Vietnam, or Bangladesh, or Malaysia, or Indonesia, all countries which face the same problem of triangulation. China may have scientific expertise, I'm leaving it out. Many other Asian countries, Brazil, we have much better expertise in energy, forests, water, etc., right? But they are never consulted. Now, you tried to consult Madhav Gadgil and some others. Now, how, I think that is also an important part of this whole process. That a country like India, and I think this was not, I mean, whatever else you may say about Nehru and Indira Gandhi, at least they're respected scientists. And it's getting worse and worse. Yeah.
Well, you've raised a very, very difficult question, Ram. And without disrespect to anybody, I have the greatest respect for your chairman. He's your chairman, right? Kasirirangan? He's no longer your chairman. Okay, so I can be at liberty to say what I want to say. Who's your chairman now? Okay. Yes, I got Madhav Gadgil to do a report on the Western Ghats. He produced an uncomfortable report, which every state government rejected. My successor came. She wanted a scientist to provide a report which every state government could accept. She got Kasirirangan. I mean, scientists must have the courage to stand up.
And also the domain expertise.
What I'm saying, I mean, a great personal friend of mine, great respect, great space scientist, but you've got to be able to tell truth to power. If scientists are also going to capitulate, if scientists are also going to be like economists, and you tell me what your view is, and then I'll tell you what my opinion is, I think that is not intellectual integrity of the type that we had in India in the 50s and 60s and 70s. I think scientists have also become politicians in their own right. They are also, M.G.K. Menon was more of a scientist, more of a politician than a scientist. Very difficult to find scientists who actually, Satish Dhawan. Can you find a Satish Dhawan today? You can't find a Satish Dhawan today. So I think, Ram, yes, the devaluation of institutions has taken place. And one of the reasons why it has taken place is because institutions have been ready to compromise with those in power. I'll tell you something, since you have been very critical of not only my party, of all politicians, and rightly so. Lalu Prasad is an object of hate amongst the Indian middle classes. And he's done much to earn that hate. But you talk to any Bihar cadre police or IAS officer, any officer, and he will tell you that the best chief minister that they have worked for is Mr. Lalu Prasad Yadav. Because Mr. Yadav would figure you out in the first 48 hours whether you're an honest man, incorruptible man, or you're a man who's going to swing with the wind. If you're honest and incorruptible, he didn't do anything to you, he allowed you to function. If you went with the wind, well, he had his uses for you. The point I'm making is that this is a two-way process. Politicians have devalued institutions, but institutions also have devalued themselves. When I was environment minister, every third environmental impact assessment report that came to me was prepared by NEERI, National Environmental Engineering Research Institute of CSIR in Nagpur. Every third environmental impact assessment. And after a while I could see it was a cut and paste job. Now, I didn't ask them to do it, but they were doing it because they felt that they needed, to have this nice, cozy relationship with those in power. So, yes, we must find ways of insulating our institutions from political, we need to ring fence some of these institutions. We also need to ensure that these institutions have adequate safeguards to protect people who actually, I think one of the bravest things that I have seen in 35 years in public life in India is a statement that 600 professors in Bangalore gave last month. Were you one of them? No, you were not one of them. You were? I tweeted. Did you see my tweet? It is the bravest decision. Yes, on Kashmir. It's the bravest statement that they have given. Nobody asked them to give it, but they said, please protect scientific institutions, allow communication, do whatever your politics may be. You were part of it, right? I think I salute you for what you have done. So I think, Ram, it's important to create a situation where the political running of these institutions is reduced to the barest minimum. I think it is possible, but as long as you're government funded, unfortunately, the room for maneuver is going to be limited. But within that government funding, there are institutions which have carved out enough of an autonomy for themselves, which go beyond individuals. But institutions also people must stand up in these institutions. And I'm sorry to say that very few institutions now, you have leadership where the younger generation of scientists are far more vocal and far more. The other day I was just telling Ravi, a young PhD from Princeton came to see me. He just joined TIFR and he wanted, he was full of life, full of energy, very critical of many of the things. So I said, why don't you go and talk to your bosses here? He said, sir, they will do whatever the minister tells them to do. So the younger guys want to do things, but the older guys are just clogging them up. So I think, this is a systemic reform that is needed, Ram. It's easy to blame the political class, and I agree with you. The political establishment has systematically ensured that the independence of institutions, but in today's world, the IITs are fairly independent. The IIMs are fairly independent.
My point really was the lack of regard for expert knowledge, even when it's available to frame better policies. I mean, just one more example. Demonetization is a very good example. I mean, it's an open secret that Raghuram Rajan was consulted, and he said, don't do it. Then they said, we want to do it, and he said, okay, if you insist you're my bosses, take out one note, not both. Right? Now, this is one note. They took out both notes, and look, we're still suffering. I mean, the Prime Minister said, give me 50 days, and I'll clean up the mess. It's 1,000 days. If he had just listened, if he wanted to do it to show that he's a clean man, and Raghuram Rajan gave him an Indian way out, take out one note, not both. Right. Okay. Now so the point is, my point. I agree with you about the pusillanimity, the weakness of people running institutions. They have to stand up. They have to be more like Satish Dhawan and less like M.G.K. Menon. I mean, to take two names. Right. Absolutely. They have to have that pride and self-respect that Satish Dhawan had, rather than go with whichever politician or party is in power, as some other scientists do. But my point was different. It is that I don't want to make it about a particular prime minister. I mean, but generally, I'd say after Indira Gandhi and Morarji Desai I would include in someone who respected science. I would, for all his peculiarities. There's this sense of, even Manmohan Singh, I don't think for all his, I mean, he may have respected economists, but I don't think he really understood what good science could contribute to this country.
Well, yeah, I mean, prime ministers find convenient figures from the scientific world, and those figures then represent the community. C.N.R. Rao became God. Whatever C.N.R. Rao said became policy. No debate. Nobody could debate because C.N.R. Rao was C.N.R. Rao. And I remember trying to tell the Prime Minister, sir, let's talk to others. Let's not depend on one man. But no, I mean, C.N.R. Rao is God. No, we also worship these figures. It's become very personalized. It's become very individual-centric. Institutional forums have atrophied. There is no science advisory cabinet. And also I agree with you, whether it is in power, whether it's in environment, whether it's in food, agriculture, the respect for Indian science has in fact gone down. There's no doubt about it. The respect for institutions, not just science, scientific advice and scientific institutions. I think we need to rethink the entire scientific enterprise once again. What we did in the 50s, we created these large scientific establishments, the Atomic Energy Establishment, we had the CSIR, we had the ICAR, we had ISRO, we had DRDO. Well, if you ask me, the only successful model that we have in India is the ISRO model. CSIR is creaking, ICAR is virtually dormant, DRDO, God alone knows what DRDO does, but Kalam sold India a beautiful dream, that we are doing everything, and we are doing hyperplane, we are doing this, we are doing that, and Kalam is Kalam, he's God again, right? We got to ask questions of Kalam. So the only system that has worked is ISRO. And I think ISRO has worked because Sarabhai had the vision, Dhawan had the extraordinary gift of putting in place systems. So Dhawan's one rule, by the way, this rule should apply to you also, Ravi. Dhawan's one rule, which I learnt many later, and not only to you, but to anybody who heads any institution. Dhawan's rule was, I will never go back to ISRO the day I retire, number one, and I will never meet any person from ISRO after I have retired. Because the Indian mentality is to go to the guy who is retired and say, Saab, aapke jaane ke baad kuch nahi ho raha hai. To make him feel good. So he avoided all contact with ISRO. He took only one PhD student. Radhakrishnan was his last PhD student, who then became chairman of ISRO. Didn't take any more PhD students and spent all his time, I think, in RR and Raman Research Institute and Indian of Science. Examples like this are very few and far between. Very few and far between. So I think we are gone are the days of the Dhawans. We can wish for the Dhawans and the Sarabhais of the world, but we're not going to get them easily. So we have to look at new institutional designs for these institutions. I think frankly, many of these institutions have outlived their utility. Yes, sir.
While you did comment on the scientists being vulnerable to political pressures and so on and so forth, is there growing scientific temper in the politicians? What do you see as the trend?
Crony.
Is there any growth of scientific temper in the politicians?
Oh, temper. Oh, scientific temper is the biggest casualty in the last decade. I think the more we become a $5 trillion economy, we'll have less of a scientific temper. We don't use the word scientific temper anymore. The last time scientific temper I saw in a government document was probably in 1985. After that, we've stopped using the word scientific temper. And that's, I think, that's the crux of the issue, by the way. Science education, scientific temper, these are big questions. And we are doing big things. We are, doing Chandrayaan, Mangalyaan. Now we're going to do Samudrayaan. All sorts of things we're doing. But scientific temper, if you go, the best example I can give of scientific distemper, not scientific temper, is the Minister for Science and Technology, who came to Raman Research Institute, who was your valued visitor. He is a walking, talking example of everything of scientific distemper. There's nothing scientific in what he says. Not one word. You want a better example of a scientific distemper? Is the HRD minister. I mean, the two guys who are key for scientific temper are the two worst examples you can give of people who are propagating a completely anti-scientific view. But where is the scientific community talking? I protested to Vijay Raghavan. I sent him an email. How could the Indian Science Congress give a forum? In the latest Indian Science Congress, there was a guy who made some outlandish claims. Outlandish. Even by their standards, it was outlandish. So I sent an email to Vijay Raghavan as you're the scientific advisor to the Prime Minister. How could the Indian Science Congress provide such a forum? He said, no, sir, we didn't provide the forum. We just came. He came and gave a talk, and it was advertised as some gobbledygook he gave. Fact is that Indian Science Congress provided him a forum. Now, why can't the Indian Science Congress Association come out with a statement on scientific temper? Why? In the last public statement that came out on scientific temper was, in fact, coincidentally done by Mr. Huxer, Rajaramanna, Satish Dhawan, PM Bhargava, who was at CCMB, all of them in 1984 or 85. After that, there's been no talk of scientific temper. So why can't the scientific community, why can't the younger scientists in all these institutions, who are bold to issue statements on Kashmir, why can't they issue a statement on scientific temper? What, young man? You did. You should. I missed it. I missed the scientific temper, but I caught your Kashmir one.
IITs and places like the IITs, people have been hauled up for having signed that letter by their own departments. So at some level, expecting young scientists who are starting out their careers to do this is actually kind of unfair. I think it's the middle level and the senior scientists who have to do it, and they've got the least to lose, but
it's a high-risk enterprise in today's environment. I agree with you. It's not going to be easy. And you have to have other options ready, if you indulge in such bravado. But you have to. That's the only answer I have to give you. There's no point in my talking of scientific temper if the scientists themselves are not talking of scientific temper. The initiative has to come from you.
So anybody from the students would like to ask something? Okay, then.
You have been talking about scientific temper. Scientific temper originated from personal contact of scientists with politicians. Now that is lacking. You have to find a solution for it. Otherwise, you take Baba, you take Sarabhai, you take any scientist, they had a personal equation with the politicians. That's why the scientific temper improved in India.
I agree with you. That system, I have to say, stopped with Indira Gandhi. It was not there during Rajiv Gandhi's time. I was witness to it. It stopped with Indira Gandhi. And Indira Gandhi, I think, did it instinctively because of her father and because of Mr. Huxer. I think these are the two reasons why Indira Gandhi did it. But she did it. You had to give her full marks till 1984, as Ram just said. As long as she was Prime Minister, Secretaries of the Environment, first was M.G.K. Menon, second was Qasim, and third was Khushu. So she respected scientists as scientists. And she didn't ask scientists, what are you going to, how, she wouldn't have come to this young man's lab and said, what is all this equipment on quantum quint? What does it mean for India? She wouldn't ask this. She would be genuinely interested. That personal contact stopped in the mid-80s. That I agree with you.
Just to add one biographical point, which is there in your book, I think, but for everyone. It's not just Huxer or a father, it's also a maternal uncle professor.
Yeah, Kailash Nath Kaul. So she had Indira Gandhi is a much maligned figure. And much of the malignment has been done by people like Ram Guha. But the fact is, she gets 4 out of 10 on preserving democratic traditions. Okay? She gets, I would say, 7 out of 10 on environment. She gets 4 out of 10 on economic policy. But she gets 10 out of 10 on science, on scientific institutions, on protecting scientists, giving scientists. Nag Chaudhary, another great name, people have forgotten Nag Chaudhary. Radhakrishnan, Madam Radhakrishnan himself, she meets him, she spends 45 minutes with him, trying to convince him, don't worry about your father, please take over Raman Research Institute. And then she meets Dhawan. Then she meets Nag Chaudhary. So that type of personal contact is not there today. It's very difficult. And it's not been there from 85 onwards. After 85, committees took over. Sri Rao, M.G.K. Menon, S. Vardarajan, all these committee guys took over. Baba, Sarabhai, Dhawan, they were not committee people. They were individual sort of charismatic personalities.
Committees are made to surface.
Yeah, I agree. Committees. But also, it is not just personal contact that led to scientific temper. Nehru also genuinely believed in a scientific temper. Genuinely believed in scientific temper. He thought he was a indifferent second divisioner in natural science tripos. So he always fancied himself as a botanist, and he did chemistry and botany. And he had been going to the Indian Science Congress from 1938 onwards. And there were a lot of people who influenced him. Meghnad Saha was a great influence on him before Homi Bhabha became an influence on him. He had a very warm relationship with C.V. Raman. In fact, I don't have it here, but I will be glad to send it to you tomorrow when I go home. There's a wonderful letter from Nehru to the education minister. By then it was Chagla. And C.V. Raman, being C.V. Raman, was giving Chagla a difficult time. So the matter reached Nehru. So Nehru writes to Chagla, C.V. Raman is the pride of India, but we all know how difficult he is. But so what? Find a way of restoring his national professorship. He was the national professor, he was, I think, India's first national professor. And there was some problem. I think Chagla the bureaucracy had enough of him, they wanted to discontinue it. So Nehru intervened. I'll send this to you tomorrow, Ravi. You should put it up somewhere in the library. It's a beautiful letter. Nehru writing to Chagla. So Nehru had this science, He had a natural, he felt more comfortable with scientists than with politicians, let me tell you that. He was very uncomfortable with politicians, but if you look at the people he spent time with, Bhabha, Mahalanobis, who was a scientist, who was basically a scientist. K.S. Krishnan, a great favorite of his. K.S. Krishnan was a great favorite of his. P.M.S. Blackett, who was got by Nehru in 48 to reorganize the entire defense research establishment. P.M.S. Blackett, he had a lot of contact with Joseph Needham. J.B.S. Holden became a great fan of Nehru. So Nehru was unique when it came to science.
That was the initial phase of independence in India.
Absolutely.
He had the zeal for it. The present day situation is not same as it was with Nehru. So present day we have to find out solutions for young scientists to come up where there are millions in India.
We have to find another Nehru, not necessarily from the family. And that is an addition that Ram would have made. By the way, Nehru was more comfortable with science than Gandhi. You may contest this. But Nehru was more comfortable with more.
The thing about Nehru was, you see, I think what is great about Satish Dhawan, there's only one scientist I've known and I've known many, I come from a family of scientists, so I've known many, who would qualify with Satish Dhawan, and that's Ubaid Siddiqui. And what was among the things that were remarkable about them was building institutions, encouraging young people, self-effacing, retiring, and last of all, respect for intellectual work done by writers, historians, sociologists, not the kind of, the normal Indian scientists, particularly Tamil Brahmins like you and me, they say, oh, you did arts, you must be useless, You must be only for women, arts, get married kind of stuff, right? Now, I think Nehru, his love of learning was such that this is something which is, you talked about his letter to Chagla about Raman. There's an equally remarkable letter that he wrote when the greatest Hindi poet of the time, Suryakant Tripathi Nirala, had no money. He got him a fellowship from the Sahitya Academy. And he said, he will spend it on drink. So give it to Mahadevi Varma to give it to him monthly, right? So that respect for learning, what we are living now, from the time of, I'm glad you mentioned Rajiv Gandhi, because we should not make it a BJP versus Congress thing. From the time of Rajiv Gandhi, the contempt for scholarship, we are basically we've been run by anti-intellectual prime ministers. Even though we've had Oxford PhD as our prime minister, I don't think that Manmohan Singh would have understood culture and literature, let alone science. So that is something which, unfortunately, is the cost we have to bear.
I think the initiative will have to come from the scientific community. That's the point I'm making. If you're going to expect the political establishment to reform, that's going to take some time. The initiative will have to come from some bold, mad people in the scientific community who have other options. When the consequences of what they do fall on them. I tell you, I have been meeting, particularly after this chairmanship of the Parliamentary Standing Committee, a lot of youngsters have coming to meet me. And saying that, we want to do this, and very critical of me also. Not that, there's no chaplusi. Very straight, very thing, and that's the way it should be. You will respect them for what they are. And they have a case to make. And this young man who came to see me from TI for first-rate example. He wants to work on climate change, he's a physicist. He wants something about climate change, but he says, sir, TIFR, everybody is into string theory. I can't get anybody to think anything other than string theory.
When you say the scientific community has to come out and say things, many people in the scientific community have come out and said things. As somebody said, people in some of these institutes have been threatened for going out and saying things. We would get letters from DST saying that you can't go out and say something on whatever subject. And so, okay, one thing is, of course, you have to take the consequences. So far, maybe there haven't been so many consequences. But even otherwise, what do? You write to newspapers, you write to the Hindu. We wrote that letter on Kashmir, who cares? It vanishes after a little while. There is no one who, firstly, the scientific community has many voices. The people who are appointed as leaders by the scientific community are those who are appointed by politicians, and they're the ones who say the things that the politicians want. If you speak out, like this young guy from TIFR, you're never seen again. I mean, not in a malicious sense, but you're just not appointed to committees. You're not. Your voice is nowhere heard, and so I don't really see how reform can come from within the scientific community unless there is some forum where those concerns are taken seriously.
Okay, let me give you a wild thought. Let me give you something that's, this issue has been bothering me for quite some time. The issue that you have raised and which Ram has raised and you also raised. It's been bothering me for quite some time as to what do we do? How do we get out of this? I think in some ways it could be argued that Nehru spoilt Indian science. He spoilt them, mollycoddled them, gave them free access, took them seriously, gave them honors, gave them lunch, dinner, breakfast, ready. And that was an unnatural world, right? So you expected that thing to continue. He seduced the scientific community in a way. I think the time has come, sometimes I think, that the scientific community must outgrow the political class. And there is a larger constituency of public debate that needs to be addressed. So why always look for trying to influence the Prime Minister or this minister or that minister? You're lucky, sometimes it may work, sometimes it may not work. But why can't you try, and I know it's easier said than done, but this is something I have often thought of, as to how is it that we create multiple points of pressure on governments to listen to a larger voice, to listen to people who are, as Ram says, domain experts, who have some scientific expertise. Sometimes it happens. Now, Madhav Gadgil, for example, was ridiculed till these floods devastated Kerala, and in a perverse way, Madhav Gadgil has got a new lease of life thanks to these natural disasters in Kerala. And the same people who were criticizing him and ignoring him are now flocking to him and asking him what is to be done. But I think one of the reasons why he was successful in doing that is because he was able to build up a larger constituency. He interacted with local institutions, he went to the local St. Teresa's College and some local Narayana Guru College. He built up that momentum. Madhav Gadgil never came to any ministry or any prime minister or served on any committee. But I think he succeeded in creating a larger community of believers. We were just talking, Ravi and I were just talking of Narlikar. Narlikar is another outstanding example one of the great things of Narlikar is his ability. You talked of scientific temper. Amongst the greatest contributions of Narlikar is on scientific temper. But you will never read about it because it's all in Marathi. And that is the greatness of Narlikar. He's been able to influence a very large section. I know, because I have experienced this over the last few years. So I think we need people, who communicate well, communicate in local languages, who are easy with communicating with lay people who don't understand science, who come from different backgrounds. There have been very few people like this in our system. Huh? Very much. Very much, but there are people. I mean, Ram's favorite example is Shivram Karanth, but Shivram Karanth doesn't come from the world of science, he comes from the world of art and so on. Professor Sharat Chandra, H.C. Sharat Chandra, is a geneticist. He has been doing a lot of work in this area of communicating in the local languages. But I think, this addressing people, how do you address people, how do you educate people, how do you create an environment for the scientific temper? We should get out of this unifocal emphasis on interface with the highest authority in the land. I think the scientific community for too long has become part of the ruling establishment. It's very difficult to find people who will actually go down to lower levels, to schools, to NGOs, to local elected institutions. I have very few examples. I've given you 2 examples I can think of, but I'm sure there must be some others.
For instance, there is a forum that is started by ICTs called Coffee with Curiosity. So often on Sundays at the planetarium, you should see the crowds. It's very encouraging to see that.
Where is this? In Bangalore?
In Bangalore.
I-
So there must be some commitment to
So that doesn't depend on government. It doesn't depend on government. I think moment you expect this thing from government, then it comes with all the costs of government control, government regulation, government do's and don'ts. There are one area, I must tell you, one state where I find local scientists very active in communication and building up public awareness is in Bengal. Bengal is a remarkable example. Remarkable example. I mean, Bengal is not a good example in one part of the triangle. As somebody said, Bengal has the worst economy because it has the most brilliant economists. But in terms of science communication, building scientific temper. If you read the Bengali press, if you read the Bengali language, if you look at the Bengali colleges, you will find many scientists doing this. Sorry?
One of the first Indian languages into which prehistory of time was translated was Bengali.
It's Bengali.
And SN Bose was a prime example. He started a whole establishment called One Year Began, which is still alive, and they publish regularly journals of science and popular.
No, I think there are examples to learn from. There are good examples to learn from. Kerala, of course, is outstanding. The KSSP is a good organization. By the way, if you're looking for organizational models, the KSSP is a good model for you to think of. And it has had very good impact. The KSSP played a very important role in making Indira Gandhi's mind up on Silent Valley in 1980s. They played a very important role. Madhav Gadgil, of course, but the KSSP continued that agitation for such a long time. Yeah, and the Tamil Nadu Science Forum, Delhi Science Forum fizzled out. But Tamil Nadu Science Forum is there. It's a very important thing. Bengal has a science forum. So I think we have in local languages, when I had these public meetings, I must tell you, on BT Brinjal, wherever I had these public meetings, Bangalore, Calcutta, Bhubaneswar, Guwahati, Nagpur, 7-8 places, the scientists couldn't speak in any language other than English. That is the other problem. The communication became a huge problem. And they were extolling the virtues of BT Brinjal. And the farmers were asking, simple questions, and scientists were unable to answer, unable to communicate in a language that was understandable. So this is another very serious issue which does not require any government intervention. It can be done by the community itself.
So we'll wrap up here. So discussions can continue over the high tea that we have organized at the library. We can proceed there. And sir, thank you very much for visiting us. So we would like to present a small token.
Thank you very much.
We can proceed to the library for